looked at sort of an introduction, and now we've looked at commodities and the process of commodification. And again, as I said in the beginning, a lot of these things are overlapped, right? So it's very difficult to talk about commodification without talking about the division of labor, and obviously it's difficult to talk about the division of labor without talking about commodification. And then, of course, when we talk about markets, we have to talk about all of these things, right? And I mentioned that at the beginning, that when you read these individual readings, you probably saw how they're, constantly entangled. But again, I'm going to try to explain individually what these things are and how they're entangled. Now, before I begin this discussion about the division of labor, I also want to draw your attention to, at the end of these sort of 4 videos, right, of the introduction, commodification, and commodities, this video on the division of labor, and then there'll be a final, probably maybe shorter video on markets. At the end of that, I will post 2 video clips from 2 feature films that really get at what the labor process is and how it works under capitalism, how the division of labor works, and really speaks to the logic and the rhythms of capitalism. The first one is a kind of funny clip. It's an old Charlie Chaplin movie where it just looks at Charlie Chaplin on the assembly line. But it actually, even though it's kind of funny, and that's one of the geniuses of Charlie Chaplin, was even through this kind of vaudevillian slapstick comedy, he reveals a lot of deeper truths about the sort of confrontation between workers and bosses, how capitalists operate, the logic of capital versus the way workers and the proletariat respond to it. Now, the second video is a more recent film that we'll look at, and it's from the movie The Founder, which maybe some of you have seen. It's about the founding of McDonald's, which is a really interesting story. But I'm just going to show you a short 6-minute clip where the 2 guys that founded McDonald's originally explain how their process worked, how they were able to, through a division of labor, but not just a division of labor, a kind of complex dance of labor and the divisions in which they created, how that allows them to produce hamburgers in 30 seconds. Now, we think of McDonald's now as really cheap, kind of not high quality food, but the original McDonald's, when it started in Los Angeles in the 50s and 60s, part of the reason it was so popular was they were able to make burgers really well, and the products actually tasted really good, and they were able to make it very, very quickly. Now, obviously that has changed in the last 50 years, but it just gives you an example of how the commodification process, and in this particular context, the division of labor, allows capital and capitalism, at least the logic of it, to produce things so quickly and intensely. Okay, so I'm going to post those after. I'm either going to do it after this video or at the end of the lecture videos, but they're really interesting to watch. Okay, so what we're going to do now is talk about labor, specifically the division of labor and the labor process. Labor, of course, is in and of itself a commodity. We talked about over the last couple of weeks how labor became increasingly commodified, right? That when you take away the means of subsistence, right? If we look at that first lecture in the transition from feudalism to capitalism, one of the key things that happened, at least in the English context, was that when the peasants were dispossessed from the land and you got that nexus of landlord, tenant farmer, and wage laborer, not only did you got the creation of this sort of simultaneous markets and markets for commodities to be exchanged, right? Foodstuffs on the one hand, right? We saw in that lecture how the rise of commercial agriculture, but because all of a sudden you had this surplus labor population that was no longer needed on the countryside, it created this labor market that could then be absorbed into other forms of employment. And eventually, and this again, we moved very quickly, but it takes place over hundreds of years. Eventually, when we get to the emergence of capitalism, when merchants start investing in production, that surplus labor then gets absorbed into the production process, which then eventually leads to industrial capitalism, where we move from a kind of, the division of labor gets so intense and the surplus value that's extracted from labor that gets reinvested in capital can be reinvested into even greater machines that create even more efficiencies, right? But we'll get there in just a minute. So, very quickly, I explained at the beginning what the division of labor was. And you have to think of labor as a commodity, just like anything else. But labor is a kind of unique commodity. It's one of the few commodities that is sentient, that has thoughts of its own, right? I mean, the examples of commodity that I used in the previous video were watches, shoes, right? Inanimate objects. But of course, the labor as a commodity is distinct in that it has hopes, desires, dreams, thoughts, actions. It has interests. It can act rationally or irrationally. It can act in its own interest or not in its own interest. It can act as a large collective or as an individual. So it is a different form of commodity, but it is nonetheless a commodity that can be exchanged. It has a use value and an exchange value, and it is bought and sold in a marketplace, right? In a capitalist marketplace. So the commodification of labor is the result of a key logic of capitalism, which is the ever greater and constant division of labor. Okay, so we looked at what the division of labor was, and if you want that sort of concrete example, think of the Lynn, Massachusetts shoemakers, right? How the merchants took control of the production process from the master craftsman and the artisanal form of production, and brought it all and consolidated it under a kind of factory system where they controlled the pace, the rhythms, and all aspects of the production process and owned the means of production in that context, right? So part of the way the division of labor works, as I explained earlier, is simply the dividing of task amongst people. Instead of making the entire product or the entire shoe or the entire watch, you make a component part of that, right? One of the best example, of course, that we get to when we get to industrial capitalism that most people think of is, of course, Henry Ford and the production line, the assembly line. And actually, if you watch the Charlie Chaplin video, what you're watching really is the assembly line, okay? That everybody's doing a different job, and as a result of that, they can produce way more things than they actually need. And one of the things that emerges out of that production process is because you're able to produce so many more commodities, right? In that case, say shoes, you have to seek out new markets, and it has to expand, right? So again, as I just want to reemphasize that the merchant is technically not a full capitalist until he or she moves into production. To understand this, let's go back to what the merchant did pre-capitalism. Again, this is a little bit of review, but it's important to emphasize. They were not engaged in the production process. The merchant was mostly, pre-capitalism, engaged in moving goods from one area to another. They were involved in the circulation of goods, not the production of goods. And the examples you can think of is the the merchants in the Islamic Empire, merchants that moved things up and down the Yangtze River Delta in China, the Hanseatic League that was, moving grain from Eastern Europe to Western Europe, or, leathers and foodstuffs and sort of salted fish and these kinds of things that could, but all they're really doing, all the way they're accumulating capital is moving something from one area to another, right? And then we saw once they get involved in that production process, that's when we get capitalism proper, right? And part of the way, as I said earlier, they were able to rationalize that is by creating a division of labor. The division of labor is the cornerstone by which we get a capitalist mode of production. Without the division of labor, there really isn't a capitalist mode of production, right? And it's important to emphasize at this point, when I'm talking about division of labor, again, this is pre-technology in a way, right? In fact, the very term manufacturer comes from the Latin manus, meaning hands, and factura, meaning to make, right? Handmade, to manufacture something, right? So the initial idea of what manufacturing is merely a person making something, producing something. And so the point I'm making is capitalism, the capitalist mode of production and the process by which capitalism produces things predates the technological revolution, which comes later, right? That's more the mid-19th century where we get this explosion of technology and machinery that just increase the production process even more and further intensify the division of labor, okay? So this is a lot of what we're getting at. Now that's the division of labor, and you guys mostly understand that by now. But the other key thing to understand here is the concept of labor power. Now what is labor power? Now labor power basically is the abstraction of human labor into something that can be exchanged for money. Now, what do I mean by abstraction? It's merely when you convert it into a numerical value, right? So here, we see the interaction of time and labor. In order for labor to be abstracted, and again, all I mean by abstracted is it's represented by a number value. It has to be measured, right? But it's measured in terms of time. As I said earlier when we looked at the commodification, time is how we think about labor, right? How much you get paid an hour. If you work as a wage laborer, you get $10 an hour, $15 an hour. That's how we think about it, even if you're on salary. Right? Even if you're a salaried employee, you could even make a lot of money as a salaried employee. You think of a lawyer or a doctor who could make several $100,000 a year. Their labor power is still measured in terms of time. It's abstracted into a number by measuring how much that's worth in a particular time span. Right? So for a salaried, high-earning wage laborer, like a doctor or a lawyer, you're earning a salary. Instead of being paid by the hour, you're making $100,000 a year or $200,000 a year. But the value of your labor is still calculated in terms of a time or a temporal value in that case. Unlike a capitalist who earns money by the increase of capital, right? There's no time sense. You invest money and you make a lot of money by what we call surplus value, which we'll get to in a minute. But before we get there, let's think more about what labor power is. Okay. So this is why, again, the commodification of time is so important. In order for labor to have an exchange value, it has to be measured in terms of time, right? So labor power is just the abstraction of human labor into something that can be exchanged for money. So it has to be abstracted into a numerical value. And that's what we call labor power. Right? How is it measured? Again, in terms of labor time, wages, or a salary per year. Now, in this form, it's in that form that labor can be sold in a market, right? In a labor market. When you go to an employer, you offer up your labor, and they usually tell you how much money you're going to make, right? For the most part, that's how it works. The actual laborer has very little power in determining how much money they're actually going to make, right? Even if you were getting into your career and maybe you end up working for a company and there's a certain negotiation over your salary, but that's the labor market, right? You're bargaining over how much money you'll actually make, and power, at least the preponderance of power, is always held by the employer in that case, right? And most of us who have ever applied for a job know exactly what that means. So that is how labor is sold into money. Now the capitalist makes money by buying a person's labor time or labor power, right? So if you are a capitalist, you buy a person's labor time or labor power. Right? That's how capitalists are able to exploit labor. Right? Now, when you use the term exploitation, we often think of something really terrible, and often it is, but it simply means you are able to use the labor, exploit the labor of somebody else for your own benefit. So again, the capitalist makes money by buying a person's labor time or labor power and exploiting it to extract what we call surplus value. Okay, now I'm going to explain what surplus value is here. So just bear with me for a minute. Okay, and again, I encourage you to ask me questions if you don't understand, or ask your TA questions, but it is fairly straightforward. And this is what surplus value means in a nutshell. So let's suppose that there is a worker who is hired for, let's keep it simple, $10 per hour. Now, once the capitalist employs that worker, the capitalist, say, has him operate, let's say he's making shoes, to keep with our example of Lynn, Massachusetts. So let's say, and let's keep it really simple and simply say that he operates a shoemaking machine, okay? It's oversimplified, but you understand. He operates a shoemaking machine. So a capitalist has hired a worker or laborer, and he is paying that worker or laborer $10 an hour to work at a shoemaking machine, to operate a shoemaking machine. And the worker, in operating that machine, is able to produce $10 worth of work every 15 minutes, okay? So every hour, the capitalist receives $40 of work and only pays the worker $10. So in 1 hour of work, the worker is able to produce $40 worth of value, and it only costs the capitalist $10, okay? But that's not the end of it, right? So that means the capitalist is capturing the remaining $30 in gross revenue. Now that's gross revenue. What gross revenue means is revenue before certain fixed and varied expenses. So once the capitalist has deducted, say, operating cost, and let's say $20 for the leather and the depreciation of the machine, right? Because you got to maintain a machine, so it costs money. The capitalist is then left with $10, okay? That's the surplus value. So thus, for pretty much an outlay of $30, the capitalist obtains a surplus value of $10. His capital has not only been replaced by the operation, right? The capital that he invested was $30, $40, but has actually been increased by $10. This is what we mean by surplus value, and this is how capital creates wealth and how it creates more capital, right? The worker cannot capture this benefit directly because he has no access or claim to the means of production or its products, right? So that surplus value that is created by the investment of labor time and materials, and remember, those materials are also produced through labor time, right? Somebody else had to make them. You end up with a surplus value of $10. So let me just go over that again quickly, okay? A worker is hired for $10 per hour, right? The capitalist has him operate a shoemaking machine. The worker produces $10 worth of work every 15 minutes, okay? So that means for every hour, the capitalist receives $40 worth of work, but only pays the worker $10 for that hour. And it creates a gross revenue of $30, right? Minus the $10 from the 40, you get 30. And now the capitalist has to deduct operating costs. Let's say $20 for the leather to make the shoes and the depreciation of the machine, right? So you minus 20 from the 30, he's left with $10. So for an outlay of $30, the capitalist obtains a surplus value of 10. So again, his capital has not only been replaced, which would be breaking even, but he's increased that value by 10. That $10 is new value, right? Now you can imagine when that happens on a much larger scale with hundreds and thousands of workers, you're dealing in the millions of dollars, possibly in an hour. And in a year, you could potentially be dealing with billions of dollars. Now, as I said, the worker cannot capture this benefit directly because he has no access or claim to the means of production. Only the people that own the means of production are able to extract surplus value. Now, what this means is that wages and prices always fall and go down. If there's a further rationalization of production, prices fall, and as a result, wages also fall. Now think about it this way. As the reading makes clear, there are sort of two ways to increase surplus value. You can simply pay the worker less, but that can be difficult. But the other way is by greater efficiencies. By creating efficiencies always evolve around a greater division of labor. The greater division of labor means creating more jobs, but for less value. Because if you're paying more people, right, you have to pay them less. And part of the reason those jobs become less valuable is if you notice the pattern in the greater increase in the division of labor, the jobs become simpler and simpler and simpler and simpler and simpler, right? So what that means is wages under a capitalist mode of production, as the division of labor is further intensified, even before we get to machines, right? Price goes down, wages go down. So wages always fall in that context. And this is why, as the reading pointed out, the service sector jobs pay so little, right? The service sector has been not immune to technology. Obviously, we are seeing automation move into the service sector. I mean, think when you call a bank, right, or any type of customer service now, you often get a recording rather than a real person, and it kind of, you know, triages you to whatever it is the problem is. Then maybe you end up speaking to a real person, but they hope that you can get the information from an automated person. So for the most part, in the service sector, the only way that you can increase efficiency is by greater and greater division of labor. And it's not surprising then that the service sector is probably the lowest paying jobs that exist, right? The only reason manufacturing jobs had high wages 50, 60, 70 years ago is not because those jobs pay well, but because those jobs were highly unionized and they were able to contest the downward spiral of labors. And through collective bargaining, we're able to bargain, because they had more power as a collective, for a larger piece of the surplus value, right? That's what we're talking about. So again, to come back to this sort of transition, the commodification of labor in time is the key to the capitalist production process. And again, it is often referred to as labor time or labor power. Labor is bought and sold in a market, just like any other commodity, right? And that market is constantly expanding, right? Capitalists will constantly look for new sources of labor, right, that they can possibly pay less. Often, if you work in a particular industry and the job gets more menial, you might jump ship and go to try to work in something else. Well, then that capitalist has to find cheaper sources of labor. Some, they can do it by exploiting different labor markets, sometimes within a particular nationality. Your factory could move from the city to the country where wages are lower, or you can bring people in from overseas, right? Anyway, so that's the labor process, the division of labor, labor power, and surplus value. And in the last video, we're going to look at the thing that's been looming in the background, which is this idea of markets.